Hello,
Hey,
I'm Alex,
I'm Val.
and we are here to talk about the 6th episode of Season 5 of The Sopranos, Sentimental Education. As always, you're in Season 5, so you probably know by now, but we watch Sopranos. We immediately come and we talk about it. So we have reflections on it, and we try to kind of get into the symbolism, what's kind of happening beneath the surface of the show. So it's an interesting episode. It's kind of a new team of people that are working on this episode specifically. We have Matt Weiner, who just joined this season, and Peter Bogdanovich is directing, who we've seen as Kupferberg, but is actually a very acclaimed director and is directing the episode. And I feel like this episode has a little bit of a different feel from other episodes. I was kind of feeling that on the first episode that Matt Weiner wrote for the Weiner? Weiner?
I think it's Wiener.
I think it is Weiner. Yeah. Anyway, I had to double check myself. But on the first episode that he wrote for this season, I kind of felt like it had its own feel. And I feel like now that we're in season 5, the show kind of starts to occupy a different space than it has before. And I feel like we're in the later part of the series. And this episode feels different. And one of the things that I was reflecting on is how little Tony is a part of it. Mm-hmm. We barely see Tony, and he's always kind of a peripheral character, and how he acts is always through the lens of how it relates to one of the other core members of the ensemble, be it Carmela or AJ, but it's never really about Tony Blundetto. It's never really about Tony Soprano. And that might be the first time that happens in this show to that extent.
I think you're right.
I mean, we had an episode earlier this season where Carmela didn't show up. Well, now we have an episode where Tony Soprano doesn't show up, and that really pushes this show into new ground, because that isn't really something that happens.
Yeah. No, there's a lot in here. I think we have a lot to unpack. So
yeah. Why don't we... Well, the very first scene of this episode, I feel like, kind of sums up one of the arcs that happens within the episode, and that is the sound of, like, a shotgun reloading as Tony Blundetto is walking through the door.
I think it's just the sound of that kind of door opening.
I think that it's conscious, and I think that they're making that sound. I think it was pretty deliberate. Val's face says otherwise right now, but it's a podcast, so you can't see faces.
I was made for this medium.
You really were.
Mm-hmm.
I wish I could share your faces with everybody.
Mm-hmm.
But no, I mean,
a face for radio.
I think that the sound effects in this show, like everything else, are done consciously. And I think that what happens in this episode is Tony Blundetto is drawn back to the mob. And he is kind of on the straight and narrow. And throughout the course of the episode, we see him go further, get this proposition from Kim, actually act on it, start up this business. But in the end, he ends up back in Tony's orbit.
So let's talk about his arc in this episode, because he really goes through a pretty huge character transition.
Yeah, he does.
I guess. Because where we first get him, he is working pretty hard at the laundry, right? He's also studying for this exam. And there's a lot of talk in this episode about education, right? And he even says, like, it's like he's doing the first 2 years of med school by himself. He loses his flashcards and his notes. We see him remaking his flashcards, like Vito's quizzing him. Mm-hmm. He's looking at them at a dinner party. We see him go and take this exam, right?
Yes.
And we find out that he has this partner who he met while he was in jail, right? Or like corresponded with while he was in jail, who, like, you know, kind of seems like an okay partner. Like, she's supportive and, you know, even though she's obviously, I mean, sorry if anyone listening is this kind of person, but like someone who would reach out to someone who's in jail and want to be their girlfriend while they're in jail, even though you've never met them prior to them being in jail.
Right.
There's something a little off about that for me, but again, if that's your life choice, like I support you.
Girlfriends making murder girlfriends.
Exactly. So, you know, like clearly she's, you know, that's also her. But anyways, like things seem to be going great, right? Like you said, this offer from Kim to have his own store, pretty great. And then things take a turn for really the worst.
They do.
And it's around the time where he finds that bag of money and drugs.
Yeah, where he's doubly blessed, ostensibly.
Yeah, I don't know what she meant by that, like doubly blessed.
Well, I mean, I think she means it pretty literally. Like, you get this business venture, and now you found money. Like,
yeah,
you're so fortunate. Like, you're being blessed, which is interesting to think about, like God blessing somebody in the way that that's talked about between Carmela and Father Phil in the same episode, and to think about Tess, perhaps. But it turns out that he's not blessed by this. It ends up drawing him into a life that is much less healthy for him.
Yeah, so like his girlfriend says, like you should invest into the business.
Yeah.
And then he ends up blowing it on an ugly suit.
You didn't like it?
It was terrible.
Oh, okay.
And ugly shoes.
He had to get it to match the shoes.
That he later has to wear to do his laundry business. That we see him then with a stripper, right? Like buying everyone Cristal and gambling his money away, basically. And then that takes him down into a darker place with the store too, right? Like something in him cracks.
Yeah, which is interesting to reflect on. I was thinking about why that happened. I mean, in a basic sense, he's kind of living two lives at one time, and it's just
what I was thinking
not
about the
sustainable.
doubly blessed thing.
Right.
That's what I like.
Yeah.
And he has twins. I don't know. Like,
well, and one is so
this...
legitimate, and the other one is coming from this life of crime. Like, it's somebody like getting away from the cops, throws out money and drugs, and now he's getting that. So he is being drawn now in these two different directions, even though he's supposed to be on the straight and narrow.
Yeah, we see him like during that, like right before he has that scene where he's painting and Kim arrives.
Yeah.
He's there with his twins, right? And he's bought them these Game Boys, and he's breaking down this wall, right? And it made me think of back in season 1 where they talked about like building things, right? Or like nobody's like, I forget exactly the line, but like our ancestors used to build things and now people just like tear things down, kind of thing.
Right.
And he's just like knocking down this wall, and he can tell his sons are kind of into that.
Yeah.
Like his sons are intrigued by that
Totally.
action. And then we have, the scene where...
Well, on that one, just before we move on, I mean, I thought it was interesting because there was other things about parenting in this episode, notably between Tony and AJ when AJ is still living with Tony, and the values that he imparts and his proclivity to violence. And it showed me that Tony Blendetto, with the sledgehammer, as he brought them in to... tear down these walls and hit something with a hammer, like that was an example of his parenting and how he valued tearing something down right after he said, do your homework on the floor, and then lets them not do that. Bought them a Game Boy. So we see him as a parent and what his values are and how he actually parents and what he's imparting on these children. And there is this kind of undertone of the destructive nature of it.
Well, and we know like the kid's mother, whatever she is, his ex or whatever it might be, like they say, like, Mom says we need to get helmets before we ride the scooters that you got us, right?
Yeah.
So like he isn't thinking about
That's good.
the safety of these twins.
Yeah, that's true. It's interesting how I was talking about the first thing that happens in the episode, but the last thing that happens in the episode is related to Tony Blendetto's storyline too, and that's Tony saying it's hard doing business with strangers, which is funny because at first I can kind of interpret that as him saying, well, it's hard to come in and me to give you the airbag business because you're a stranger and you haven't been around. But that's clearly not what he means. It's kind of like it can be interpreted two ways, but with the smile on his face and everything we know, like he's happy to have him back. He wanted him back and involved with the mafia the entire time.
And Tony Soprano loves other people's sorrow.
Yeah.
He loves seeing other people like fucked up.
Yeah. Kind of like that song at the end.
And needing him.
Blues is my business and business is good. I really wish you could see Val's face now. I just thought I would say something that made her face go nuts. Val finds the the lyrics of the show sometimes a bit heavy-handed for those of you who can't see her face.
I'm not even going to go there today because I don't like to criticize The Sopranos, but it is one thing that I do have a big issue with. Yeah, but I'm not going to go there.
All good.
It's just like too literal for me. I don't like
Got it. All
Okay.
good.
But I want to talk about the scene in between. So we find out he has $400 of the, approximately $12,000 left. We have him in this space where there's a koi pond and fish. So there's a lot of fish imagery in this episode. So I want to come back to that maybe. He's painting these weird lines on the walls, which remind me kind of like, what's it called when they're measuring your heart rate? Like a heart rate monitor, I guess, but not. But you know what I mean? Like when you can see like the output.
Oh,
and
yeah.
It's like the up and down triangle lines.
Yeah, up and down triangle lines.
That's what that kind of reminded me of.
Unfortunately, I've not done the equivalent of 2 years of medical school.
Me neither. Me neither. And then for no reason, really for no reason, he loses it on Kim and he beats him up really viciously, knocks him into the koi pond. I don't really know why he does. It's just like self-sabotage, self-destructiveness. Yeah. Like maybe it is like it's too much for him living these two lives, or he can't quite see himself as this legitimate guy that he's really trying to become, or doesn't believe in himself as much or something. But he just loses it. And then I think it's interesting how he hurts his back, right? As a masseuse, right? For me, that's kind of like even that's not really going to be, like, it's not even like, oh, this store is not going to work out, but he's still going to go on and be a masseuse somewhere else.
Yeah.
Like,
there's no way.
There's no way. And yeah, so I don't know, like, why do you, and there's
also,
a fish flopping on the ground, to go back to fish.
Yeah, totally. Well, even like that, those kind of poles of restorative medicine and destruction.
Yeah.
The kind of polarity of those two things that are constantly existing in Sopranos, and the fact that he goes from one to the other.
Yeah.
Like helping people and restoring their bodies to damaging people's bodies and attacking Kim kind of represents how he moves from this honest career path to the not honest one. Mm-hmm. One thing that I found really interesting in this episode is how that space, when they first go there, is a travel agency, and Tony Blundetto is there with Tony Soprano, and there's tons of posters on the wall showing places like India, Hawaii. There's all these foreign places that are just so out of the kind of spheres of life that surround Tony Soprano and all the people of the Soprano family and the mob family. Those realms are just so foreign, so distant. And I think that what Tony Blundetto is doing is so foreign and so distant. And while they're in that space, it really kind of shows how they're very far away from everything that we've experienced as a part of the mob family.
Yeah.
And they tear down that travel agency, and it kind of eventually turns into this violent thing with the koi, the fish flopping around, dying. But it is really interesting to see Tony in that space, because he just really doesn't fit in. And for me, seeing all those distant places just hammers that home even more.
Yeah, there's something about all those wires that are hanging down too, like makes it kind of like jungle-like or something like that. There is something, I don't know. It's a really interesting choice they made.
Yeah.
I don't know what would make all those wires hang down. Like what happened there.
Right. I don't know.
But yeah.
There's an interesting relationship between Tony Blundetto and Christopher in this episode too. Maybe in part because of what Christopher's gone through as someone who went through rehab. Tony Blundetto is somebody who went through prison. Interestingly, they reference the experience of an ex-convict to the experience of an immigrant. Well, there's also kind of this relationship to Christopher as an ex-addict.
Yeah.
There's like Chris like putting his arm around Tony Blundetto. He's kind of supportive. He's supportive of him going through these 2 years of medical school. He kind of like understands
not medical school, but
not medical school, of like medical school. But the commitment and the work ethic, there's something there that he kind of gets.
There's a line too where he talks about how like someone says that Kim sees something more in Tony B. And then it kind of flashes to Chris, who, like, that's how he kind of, like, he feels like that with Tony. Like, that,
Right.
like, Tony sees something in him
Right.
more than what other people see, right? And
Right.
so, like, sometimes it takes that chance for people to make something of themselves, right?
Yeah.
But it also shows the connections between the two of them, how they both kind of, like, self-sabotage and
Totally.
destroy the good things that they have
Right.
in their lives, too.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then we see, like, his girlfriend yelling at him by the end, too. She's so sick of his gambling. It's kind of like Adriana, right? Like, being so sick of his drugs and stuff like
Yeah.
that. So,
Totally. It was also interesting seeing, like, the other members of the family talking about his relationship with Kim, as Tony refers to it in the end, doing business with strangers. But, like, Polly saying, remember Pearl Harbor, which is so preposterous considering he's Korean. But, again, it just shows, like, how out of the kind of normal zone of the mob they are at that point. Like, that Polly doesn't even know the difference between Koreans and Japanese.
yeah. I mean, nor would we expect him to.
No.
I'm surprised he didn't make some other reference.
Yeah.
Really.
But it's just such, like, a small scale frame of reference that comes from New Jersey. That's really all these people have experienced.
But yeah, no, I still don't. Yeah, I still can't quite wrap my head around why he would do that to Kim. Like, why he would react that way.
Yeah, I mean, he is in some parts, I think, just, like, kind of falling apart because he's, staying up all night. He's, been hurting himself. He's, like, sleeping for 2 hours and other nights not sleeping at all, just kind of showing up. So I think it's just, he's just kind of falling apart and taking it out on Kim because it's difficult. And he's drawn back to...
Yeah.
I don't deny, though, that there's probably more to that. I mean, I think that's the very kind of, like, surface read on it. But psychologically, it's an interesting thing to think about why he would kind of snap.
Yeah.
I think the self-sabotaging is definitely part of it. And I think that double blessing is relevant. And it's interesting that ultimately it is that gift, quote-unquote gift, of money and drugs that eventually draws him back into that life.
Yeah.
It's like easy money, right?
Yeah.
As opposed to work.
Him working hard.
And
yeah.
Kim, he was offered two paths and he makes a choice.
Right.
It's really fascinating, actually. So when he gets that easy money, it lulls him back in.
Yeah.
But with Kim, he's offering something very different. It's like a religion to these people. This, this small business.
Yeah.
Enterprising kind of attitude. So ultimately, when he's given something easy, it forces him back to being a monster.
Yeah. It was interesting. I was trying to make sense of their, like, it was kind of a, I don't know, like, he, like, kind of misspoke. But earlier in the episode, Kim talks about, like, if you mess up one more time, like, I'll show you the window.
Right.
And there is something, like, I don't know, like, thinking about these escapes, like, thinking about, like, what, like, opening a window for someone, like, kind of, like, giving them, I don't know, like giving them this little, like there's this little window of time where Tony Blendetto could have done something different.
Definitely.
And I think we face that with all of our characters too, right? Like there's these little like fleeting moments where it's like they could have made a different choice here and gone a different direction.
Yeah. The difference is that Tony Blendetto actually does make different choices. He goes so much further down the road than pretty much anybody else ever has. And up until this point, these are the only reflections we have on him. He actually is different than everybody else because he actually does assert himself as an honest person, hardworking person.
Yeah.
Now it's starting to change, but I mean, he's had a lot more integrity than anybody else we've really seen from people of his position.
Oh well, that's over now.
Oh well, that was nice.
I also want to talk about Carmela.
Well, yeah, that's huge in this episode.
So
the one thing before we switch, because that's so major, and I think that really is kind of the focal point of this episode, is thinking about Kim also kind of as a father, because there's a lot of examples of these kind of father relationships, even comparing that to that kind of like tough love, showing him the window, also to like AJ and Tony. Tony kind of trying to show tough love, I guess, but just kind of falling into violence and taking some of the parenting that he would have received from Johnny and Livia, and now showing that to the next generation and showing how hopeless this whole cycle kind of is. It's really interesting too how like you start to, there are some things that happen in this episode that reflect how AJ has some of the same attitudes as Tony, and those have been passed on, like calling Wegler gay. And it's like they're threatened. They have no understanding of this person. And Wegler, and I was kind of thinking this is a segue into the whole Carmela Wegler storyline, but Wegler represents this intellectual kind of guy that also occupies such a different space than everybody from the New Jersey family that it's threatening, and they have no understanding of it. It's almost like these faraway places, right, in the travel agency.
Yep.
And they just kind of call it gay. They don't get it. And obviously they're wrong. He's not gay.
He's super straight.
Yeah. Turns out he's banging AJ's mom.
Turns out. Yeah, so I don't really know where to start with that. But yeah, so we have AJ return home, right? So like Tony kind of has this failure of parenting. The parenting skills that he has are violence and issuing threats.
Yeah.
And giving rewards
and
for
giving
no
pizza.
reason. Pizza. Like, that's all, like, that's his toolbox. He doesn't have really anything else to offer there. So, you know, I was always surprised, like, Carmela wasn't more mad about, or, like, wasn't harder on not having AJ come back.
Yeah.
Like, kind of just making them both live with that. But I guess she is his mom. So.
Right.
And she's worried about his school success, clearly, because it interrupts her sex life a lot in this episode also. So yeah.
Yeah.
AJ is also compared to Fredo Corleone.
He is.
In this episode by his teacher, Fisk.
Fisk, who also says that the
Tom.
world needs ditch diggers.
Tom Fisk.
Which is interesting because that time where Wegler actually goes and confronts Fisk is only after Carm pushes again against Wegler about what's happening with Fisk. So there is this kind of direct line from Carmela and her words and her desires to actually using Wegler to go against Fisk and get something for AJ. She does kind of like weaponize her sexuality to get something that she wants. Interestingly, in the very beginning of the episode too with Fisk, we have Carmela talking about Fisk's bias against Italians immediately.
Yes.
Like she goes that road about the Fredo Corleone. So it is complicated because Fisk does actually reference that.
Yeah.
It is so simple for Carmela to immediately blame this on the Italian-American stereotype.
Yeah.
It's so simplistic in the end for her to say, what was it? I was married to Tony. My motives will always be called into question. Hugh then just says, well, and then there's an edit and then it cuts away. So it is overly simplistic because Carmela actually was called out in some ways for something that I believe she actually was, a user.
Yeah.
And yet her reflection and her takeaway is very black and white.
It was bias. It was bias
It's
against
the same thing as she was doing in the
Italian-Americans.
beginning of the episode. So there are these kind of things that are introduced at the beginning of the episode and don't change by the end. But Carmela, it's very simple to say they're biased against Italians. They're biased against my husband. That's why this bad stuff is happening. There's no personal accountability. There's no kind of reasoning with what you've done, you know, how you've behaved and how perhaps your actions have impacted other people.
Yeah.
So it's interesting because clearly the problem is that AJ sucks at school, has never worked.
Yeah.
There's even other things, you know, Carmela saying he never cheated, you know, like this is new. At least he always tried. And then very quickly, Wegler's like, well, he did. What about verbum day? She's like, oh, well, that's different. He was just acting out. So, I mean, even Wegler, who's just come into the scene, he even knows that that's preposterous. Yeah. There's been a steady decline for AJ where he has been cheating. Yeah. He's been brought up by, you know, somebody who profits off of the misfortune of others. We even have, interestingly, Carmela in this episode, an examination of her as a character who is cheating on her husband in this relationship as Catholics who are married, and that's an issue for them. But I think based on the value system that the Sopranos have imparted on their children, you know, it's hard to believe that AJ would be able to avoid that.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah, like definitely we have a lot called into question here with this relationship between her and Wegler. And I think like I'm on, you know, more of the side of what you were saying, which is like, I think that she did know what she was doing. I don't know if like outward, like consciously necessarily.
I think she represses the implications of it, but I think she definitely knew what she was doing.
You know, like, and we've seen her manipulate to get her way before, you know.
She even basically admits it. How is asking people you love for help using?
Yeah.
And Wegler kind of looks around and he's like, what the
do.
fuck?
Yeah,
that's what people do. It's like, well, no, that's not what people do. Can't you just have relationships with people and care for them and not ask them to do things for you? That's a very transactional relationship with people.
I mean, the relationship is really kind of ethically questionable to begin with, right? Like, for both.
Yeah.
Like,
it turns out that Wegler really is a dick when all is said and done.
Is he?
I think so. I think that, like, we are kind of...
He's no Noah Tenenbaum.
Yeah, but in the end, he was saying, like, to Carmela, like, oh, you know, like, you left me with a heart on, like, when she left.
Yeah.
It's just like, dude.
I know. Well, he had his own motivations.
I guess, right. But, I mean,
know.
I feel like he's manipulative, too. Like, he's even using these books as manipulation to get Carmela to sleep with him.
Totally.
You know, like with Madame Bovary, and she's handing her the book and talking about the undertones, and it's boring on the surface, but as he, like, leans in, he's using his own domain of...
Madame Bovary, she says that nothing really happens and there's too many words.
Good job, Carmela. You're great.
Yeah.
I don't think Carmela would like this podcast.
Maybe she would. No, like, so yeah, like it's ethically questionable. Like, there's, like, we're more exposed to Carmela's reasons for being in this relationship, but, like, why is Wegler? I think he's, like, looking for something exciting.
I think he also just likes Carmela, you know, and he's attracted to her.
Yeah. There's something, I don't know, there's something more to it. Like, he could have picked, like, first of all, like, to pick a mom of a student's, like, a student that you're dealing with pretty closely, probably not the best idea. And I think he does kind of like the danger aspect of it too, you know? But he really is in it for this, like, sexual aspect. I don't think he's really super in it for anything else. So, like, yeah, he was a dick at the end when he was like...
Even before, though, even in that same scene, he's saying, like, oh, you're a virgin. It's my lucky night. It's like...
That was a joke. Like, she was like, I haven't been with anybody.
Right. I guess.
Yeah,
it's kind of weird.
I don't know. He's not the worst character for me.
No, I mean, in the context of The Sopranos, he's probably the best dude we've ever seen.
Yeah, like, you know, I don't know, they both have something in it. It's questionable for both of them, like I was saying. He and Father Phil are kind of put in comparison to each other. They absolutely are. In this,
in fact, even edited from one to the other. Carmela does herself
saying
up.
That they remind her of each other.
Carmela's doing her hair and, like, dressing up very specifically for her meetings with both Wegler and with Father Phil.
Yeah.
Going out for dinner with both of them.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really interesting.
Yeah. She's also not completely honest with Father. Like, even though she's honest with him about other things, like, she purposely goes out for this dinner with him to kind of, like, catch him up on this. Like, I don't know why she really...
I think there's a power control, like, there's a power dynamic thing of, like, her being able to hold something over Father Phil because she has been sexually active with somebody, and they didn't have that.
Like,
and
why are you gonna tell your priest? I don't know. But, like,
no, it's weird.
It's like she clearly, like, really wanted to tell him, but then she's like, oh, we were working on a project together. Oh, actually, he reminds me of you.
Yeah. I thought he was gay.
But he's intellectual, right? And they are both kind, like, their motivations for being with Carmela are both questionable also, right? Like, kind of like I was saying, like, and we've talked about Father Phil before and his kind of moral and ethical issues, right? But they both are attracted to her. And she's able to manipulate them both pretty well to still get the things that she wants.
Okay, so here's something interesting that you're actually just making me think about. It seems like there's kind of two masculine prototypes that Carmela is attracted to throughout the course of the show.
Yeah.
One is this kind of, like, rugged, masculine, Furio, Vic Musto type. Mm-hmm. The other, who's, like, kind of maybe has a European sensibility, is in touch with his feelings, but very kind of strong. Mm-hmm. And the other kind is this person who comes from, I guess, like, more of a intellectual background, a more intellectually stimulating kind of area, but at the same time has this kind of ethically questionable connection to her life, which is really interesting because of when you think about all the ethical complexity that surrounds The Sopranos. It's interesting that she's attracted to these people where there is a question of ethics to be involved with them.
Yeah.
In fact, actually, I take it back. Everybody has that.
Yeah.
And maybe that's, Furio has that. Vic Musto has that.
What was Vic Musto's issue?
Well, actually, you're right.
I think he was
Less
pretty
so.
clean.
Yeah, he was related though to he was a relative. Anyway, but it was of a.
That's weird.
Yeah, no, not her relative. Anyway, that was about as clean as it got for her. But it is really interesting to think about her being drawn to people in these situations where there is kind of like an ethical question of how that could or should work.
Well, it's interesting, like her feelings that she goes through with having this relationship. Because on the one hand, she is kind of like proud of it and obviously like very happy, and she's like daydreaming about it, and she's talking about her sex life, and like she's feels good. She smiles at herself in the mirror, right?
Which is fast. You almost never see that in this show. Think about just recently Tony looking at himself in the mirror, a very isolating shot from a distance, him in his boxers, he's overweight, he's looking at himself. People are typically sad or reflective or realizing that something needs to change in their life because they hit a crisis point. Carmela's actually happy.
Yeah, and I don't know if it's I don't know how conscious she is of if it's just like the physicality and the romantic attention, or if it is this kind of like getting what she wants out of someone on a deeper level. Or both. But it's interesting that Father Phil kind of says they have that conversation why would God bring him into my life? And he was like, that's sin talking, and like is it God that put him there, or is it someone else, right?
Right.
So there is kind of this it is, again, it's just questionable, whether she's being driven by kind of the good, the good things, or by these kind of underhanded or manipulative things.
Right.
And then there's the fact that, then she goes later on in the episode, right? She goes to confession, and she talks about her feelings of passion, right? But he's like, I need to absolve you. I can't absolve you of a sin that you're going to continue to commit. And about being with someone beyond the here and now. And it relates to that Abelard and Heloise book, I think, too, which is an interesting combination. It's this religious / intellectual book, and one of them's a scholar and then becomes a monk or whatever it is. I have not read it, so I'm just speaking from what I learned today in The Sopranos. That one was a student and one was kind of like a teacher, and they had this timeless romance through letters, right? That this thing went on. She weirdly refers to Heloise as Eloise, which I don't know how that's connected back into the Eloise stuff, but there is this kind of combination of those two characters that I think shows kind of Carmela's two sides of something. Yeah. Or at least two sides of herself. And I think it goes back into what you were saying about these kind of two types that she has that she's attracted to. There is this, she is kind of caught between, what's right and what's, I don't know. I don't like to say right, but it's from what perspective is she looking at it, and how can she judge it based on these certain perspectives? Yeah. So religion might view something as wrong, whereas intellectually it is logical. Right?
Totally. I found that confession scene really fascinating. Even just the way that the scene was presented, the red light on Phil, similar to what we were talking about in the last episode, the use of red light on Tony, the use of red light in Miami and calling all cars. A lot of that kind of filter when we're seeing something through it, or that kind of lighting on characters is typically indicative of something in this show. And it kind of complicates the advice that we're getting from Father Phil, as I think his advice often is. Like, his advice often isn't leading people in the best direction, isn't actually connecting people to that kind of like greater spiritual plane, isn't actually connecting people with the eternal, even though it sells itself as doing that. It's not actually that helpful. It's interesting too that Carmela talks about feeling like Maria in West Side Story. That Father Phil says, well, from what I recall, Abelard and Heloise ends badly. And as we know, West Side Story obviously ends badly for Maria, too. So at this point in the episode, even if I hadn't seen it before, I'm getting the feeling that this isn't going to lead somewhere good.
Right.
And knowing about Carmela and Tony Soprano, one has to assume that even if it didn't end the way it did, it would probably end worse. Probably more like West Side Story with rival gangs and... you know, a lot of people dying. Yeah,
well, it's weird when she, like, brings the gun to bed.
That is an interesting scene. And it makes me wonder why she's doing it, because she keeps on looking at a picture of Tony out fishing with AJ.
Yeah.
With a big smiling face. Yeah, so but what I was thinking is, like, is she getting the gun? Is she getting it to kind of protect herself from Tony?
I know.
Is she getting it to replace Tony as a protector? When she's looking at it, what is she interpreting from the picture that she wants a gun there for?
Well, and she, like, it's immediately after, like, she goes from being in Wegler's bed and they've had sex, and she goes home and she sneaks into her house, and then she sees the picture and she sees Tony, and then she brings this gun to bed with her and puts it beside her. So I just feel like it's like that there's something missing beside her. I don't know.
The big question for me is she worried about Tony, or is she worried about not having Tony? That was the question that I posed.
Yeah, I know. Really strange. The other thing that I find was, like, focused a lot for her, well, we see a lot of, like, Carmela's chest in this episode. But we also, because of that, we see how she always keeps her jewelry on, even when she's really naked. She didn't have her wedding ring on, but she did have, like, 800 necklaces on, and other jewelry as well. So I find that interesting too. Like, those were clearly given to her by Tony. Right. She doesn't have this jewelry from other people, nor is she, like, going out and buying jewelry, I don't think. So that there was, like, I don't know. Later on, like, she calls Wegler a wolf in sheep's clothing. Yeah. But I think, like, you know, she's really the one who's a wolf in sheep's clothing. I
agree.
And she's putting herself, like, she spends a lot of time how she dresses, right? Like, to present herself in this certain way. But even when, like, she's, like, you know, ostensibly, like, takes off her costume, right? Like, makes herself the most...
She's still asking about AJ when they're having...
like, they're like, sex, so, like, she still has that on. Yeah. I guess that's wolf's clothing. I'm not sure, but, you know, somewhere along that metaphor.
Right. Yeah, no,
being
absolutely.
a wolf or being a sheep, I'm not sure.
I thought it was interesting, too, while they're lying on the ground, she talks about thinking about painting the ceiling blue. And it's like sticking a hand in the Caribbean, which really related to the travel agency for me in these faraway places. And blue being a color that we've talked about that's very distant from the black and white world of the mob. We've seen people wear all blue before in moments of kind of trying to differentiate themselves or distance themselves from the New Jersey lifestyle. But it did make me think, especially with the sticking hand in the Caribbean, like, what could be more distant from New Jersey than that? It is one of these foreign zones that she's trying to access in some ways through being with Wegler. Yeah. There was another one, even when she was talking about Carmela, the symbolism of Piggy's glasses as representing intellectualism. Right. There's just all these things that are so foreign to any of the characters that we've dealt with. Yeah. Thinking about metaphors, discussing them outright, talking about foreign places. There really is this yearning to be in a different kind of lifestyle. But ultimately it just doesn't work and everything ends up where it started. So it's pretty nice.
The other part I thought was interesting was, like, in the scene, I think it is where she's talking about the Caribbean, I think, or perhaps the one before that, where she's talking about AJ's paper, and then she's like, she's not really feeling it, she's not really getting it. Oh, so it's before the Caribbean line, but she talks about, she's like, I can't do this, like, in the eyes of the church, I'm still married, I'm a bad mother, and then she walks out into the rain, and you know, I think like that's what, when you were talking about the Caribbean, that is also what reminded me of that, is kind of like this water symbolism that we've seen, this like desire for purity, right? Even her like going to church for confession and stuff like that.
Ablution.
For ablution. She like she feels righteous by doing that kind of thing, right? But she's also kind of like Tony Blendetta, like she's drawn back in based on getting something, you know, getting something from her efforts kind of thing, right? Like she like finds out that AJ gets a okay grade on his paper.
See, I feel like her going out into the rain, though, leaving Wegler's house, is like her going out into the storm that she was protected from by being with him. Like she's returning to that more storm-like world around the Sopranos. Like she's leaving that safe haven of being with somebody like that.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah.
There's an aspect of that for me.
I can get that. I just do think like there was like a lot of water symbolism in this, right?
There is.
Like those two we just mentioned, all the fish, right? Like we have even like Fisk being referred to as a cold fish. We have this koi pond. We have, there was another one I wrote down somewhere, but I can't find it. So one of the dishes, I forget, something about food and fish. So we have all this kind of like water symbolism going on too. And so I just think like we've seen other, and even like the sweat on their bodies, like when they're, I don't know, like there's just something about that. I can't quite put my finger on it, but like going out into the rain, like kind of like choosing this righteous path, or feeling like she's like, because she's like, in the eyes of the church, we're still married, and she like walks in this rain. I don't know.
Yeah. It's such a weird relationship. Like, you know, her constantly pushing about AJ like right after they have sex, and him saying, well, all of our students matriculate. Like, it's just like, it's a very strange dynamic.
I remember the Tony Fish picture. Tony.
Oh, right.
Fish
Yeah,
picture.
of course. Yeah.
Sorry.
It's so strange, even outside of the obvious ethical questionability of a counselor getting with one of his students' mothers.
Moms. Yeah.
It's pretty weird. There's another great scene, actually, just in terms of symbolism, when Tony walks into the house. Carmela's, I think she's like...
She's like handling that cucumber.
Yeah. But she's like in the window. The light is kind of like glowing over her. Tony walks in, stops
He's super
there.
dark.
He's completely in the shadows.
Yeah.
And they show him completely in the shadows and her completely in the light. So I can't think of something really any stronger about symbolizing the kind of worlds that
acting that happens.
Oh man, if you guys want a good time, find that scene.
They must have reshot that.
Yeah, in the episode, watch it and just watch Edie Falco's face, because I don't know what was happening on that take, but it's
I
a
don't
good
think
one.
It was the best one.
No.
Yeah.
And she's the best actor ever, but that take, that's not her fault.
Yeah. I guess just with that, like I think like the scene where he says, like where Wegler says outright to her, like, I think you're a user, Carmela.
Yeah.
You know, and they have this kind of back and forth where he's like, you're using your pussy as a weapon.
Which she didn't have to say that.
He didn't have to say it like that. It was weird. But then, you know, she uses like his education as a weapon too. Like, well, I don't have a master's degree.
Right.
And then she leaves him with a watch your step, which again, like just shows me how, you know, she is being manipulative, and she is like, that's who she is. Right. Right. Like she's the wolf in sheep's clothing.
Totally. Absolutely.
She's the one who comes across and as this like, you know, friendly mom. Yeah. And she's not. No. You know, I mean, she like, it's not like, you know, she wants the best for AJ, like, et cetera, et cetera. It's all fine. But yeah. And
if we think about like the family that she is a part of, like her and Tony as parents, like that scene where AJ is at home with Tony, and like that violence is set off over, like Tony says like, oh, you're just perfecting that pissy look on your face, and then AJ says, well, if I just came home drunk, then I'd be like you. And that's what kind of like
sounds like you
is the catalyst for violence. So I just think about like, again, like that line of generations, and like how these children are learning from their parents, and how violence is now incorporated and passed down, and looking pissy, and probably alcoholism, and then thinking about who Carmela is as a mother, and like she has this part of her that actually really is very wolf-like, and that watch your step does kind of embody more where she kind of comes from as a person at this point and who she is as a character than a nice mom.
Yeah, well, and even her own dad, is like that line where he's like, well,
right.
Like,
that's really all there is to say. Well, I like this episode.
Me too. I thought it was an amazing episode.
I like Matt Weiner joining the team. I think he does a great job.
Yeah.
Kind of makes me want to watch Mad Men again.
Maybe.
Yeah.
This is very tiring.
It's a whole world. Yeah, we're going to finish The Sopranos, then we're going to take a long break. Before we start our Mad Men podcast.
I don't know. For me, you know what? Matt Weiner, like...
he can...
Yeah, like great Sopranos episodes.
Yeah.
But,
great Sopranos episodes.
And when you go out on your own, it's hard.
Sometimes. I'm a fan.
I mean, just like I'm not the biggest fan of Boardwalk Empire either.
Well, neither am I.
And some great people from The Sopranos went there too. There's something very magical about The Sopranos.
There's something very magical.
And there was a combination of a lot of amazing
totally.
factors
It's really interesting, to think about how all these people came together and what they had when David Chase was directing them. It's really something. And sometimes you can see what they brought to Sopranos, but what they lack when they go out on their own.
Yeah.
It's fascinating.
Yep. But great episode.
Thank you for listening.
We're almost like halfway through this season, thank goodness.
Yeah. But we appreciate you listening.
Totally.
And we'll be back soon with episode 7. And then we'll be back with episode 8.
Bye.
And another and another and another.
Okay, bye.
Okay. Thanks.